At first glance, it's just another sepia-toned portrait. 5 men standing proudly in front of a painted backdrop. A father, his 3 sons, and an older brother beside them. Nothing unusual, nothing ominous. But look a little closer, and the unease creeps in. The father's posture is guarded, his arm crossed as if holding something back. The eldest son stares straight ahead with eyes far too old for his age. 3 days after this photograph was taken, every man in that picture was dead. No break-in, no robbery, no clear reason, just silence, confusion, and a mystery that refused to fade. More than a century later, this single image, captured in Hartford, Connecticut in 1901, remains one of the most haunting puzzles in American history. What happened inside that house full of men? And what truth might still be hidden in that photograph's frozen expressions? If you're drawn to stories like this, where history turns dark and the past whispers from old photographs, stick around. Tap subscribe, hit the bell, and join us as we explore forgotten tales of men whose lives ended in mystery. And if this story grabs you, give it a like. It helps more curious minds find these haunting echoes of the past. The year was 1901. Hartford, Connecticut was buzzing with the sound of progress. Iron wheels clattering on cobblestone, smoke curling from new factory chimneys, the air thick with ambition and uncertainty. Inside a small photographic studio on Main Street, a father named Edwin Graves adjusted his collar in front of a brass mirror. He was joined by his 3 sons, Samuel, Thomas, and Henry, each trying to stand tall in hand-me-down suits that didn't quite fit. The photographer, Mr. Keaton, a meticulous craftsman with powdered sleeves, directed them into position. "Back straight, eyes steady," he said, pulling a black cloth over his head as the lens focused on their faces. The moment was supposed to be simple, a keepsake, a symbol of the Graves men's resilience. They had survived another harsh year of business, and Edwin wanted to mark it before winter came. But the camera captured more than posture and pride. It caught something else, a tension no one in the room could name. Samuel, the eldest, stood beside his father, hands clenched, his jaw set not in discipline, but in restraint. Behind him, Thomas shifted slightly, unable to keep still during the long exposure. Henry, barely 9, stared straight ahead with a blankness that seemed too deliberate, as if mimicking the seriousness he saw in the older men. The flash erupted, a burst of white that froze them forever. Then silence, the faint whir of the camera winding down, the smell of burnt magnesium drifting through the room. Edwin thanked Mr. Keaton and stepped out into the chill of the October air. Hartford was alive outside, vendors calling out, carriage wheels grinding past. But something about that photo session clung to him. He tried to shake it off. It had been a long year. His textile business was barely holding on, and the constant letters from creditors had begun to wear him thin. Still, he told himself, this picture would stand as proof that the Graves men endured. They had been through worse. Or so he thought. That evening, Samuel sat alone in the workshop behind their house, the smell of ink and paper heavy around him. He ran his fingers over the order ledgers, numbers that no longer added up. He knew more than his father realized. He had seen the overdue notices hidden under the desk drawer. He had heard the quiet sighs late at night when Edwin thought his sons were asleep. The Graves home, though outwardly solid, had begun to crack from within. Unspoken debts, silent expectations, a pressure that pressed on every word left unsaid. On the surface, their neighborhood admired them. 3 disciplined sons, a father respected for his craft, men who never faltered in public. But behind closed doors, the weight of dignity was crushing. In those days, failure wasn't just an economic setback. It was a stain on manhood itself. Reputation meant everything, and Edwin's had begun to fray. The morning after the photograph, he visited the store as usual. He greeted the clerks, rearranged the bolts of cloth, and smiled for customers he could no longer afford to disappoint. To anyone passing by, he seemed calm. But under the polished surface, his mind raced. There was a deadline approaching, a payment he couldn't meet, and the thought gnawed at him like a rat in the dark. At home, Samuel pretended not to notice the growing tension. He took his brothers to the yard, taught them how to throw a ball, forced laughter where silence wanted to live. That afternoon, Mr. Keaton delivered the finished photograph. Sepia-toned, perfectly balanced, the kind that would outlast every memory. Edwin placed it on the mantel, studying each face with quiet pride. But the longer he looked, the more the image unsettled him. Something about Samuel's eyes, something about his own rigid stance, as if the picture were holding a mirror up to more than appearance. For years afterward, locals would say that photograph carried a strange heaviness, that even before the tragedy, it seemed to know what was coming. That night, a storm rolled over Hartford. Rain drummed against the glass, thunder shook the shutters, and inside, Edwin sat at his desk, staring at the bills that refused to disappear. He could still hear his sons upstairs, Thomas and Henry arguing softly about who would get the larger blanket, Samuel silencing them with an older brother's authority. It was an ordinary sound, yet it felt like farewell. Lightning flashed, illuminating the photograph on the mantel. For a split second, the faces seemed to move, eyes glinting, shadows alive. Just a trick of light, Edwin told himself, but deep down he felt something shift, a premonition he couldn't explain. 3 days later, that photograph would be evidence, a relic of a story no one would ever fully understand. For now it was simply a portrait of men, unaware that their calm expressions were about to become the most haunting thing Hartford had ever seen. Outside, the storm passed. Inside, the Graves house stood quiet, heavy with the weight of everything that hadn't been said. And on the mantel, beneath the flicker of a dying lamp, the photograph waited, a silent witness to the last peaceful night the Graves men would ever know. Dawn crept across Hartford through a pale fog that rolled off the river, softening the edges of chimneys and rooftops. In the narrow lane where the Graves house stood, the world felt strangely muted. Inside the workshop, Edwin's desk lamp still burned from the night before. Ledger pages fluttered in the faint draft from a cracked window, and the smell of oil, ink, and damp wood mixed in the air. Samuel woke first. He always did. Habit, discipline, or maybe worry. No one could tell. He moved quietly through the hall, checking each door, then went to the kitchen to start the stove. His brothers joined soon after, both rubbing their eyes, half-dressed for the morning. The house sounded normal again, the clatter of tin cups, a cough, the scrape of boots on the floorboards. Outside, the factory whistle blew its first note of the day. Men across the neighborhood stirred to life, calling to one another as wagons rumbled toward the mills. Edwin stepped into the kitchen, tie loosened, eyes shadowed but calm. "Finish breakfast," he said. "We've got work waiting." His voice carried the same steady authority it always had. They ate quickly, talking little. Samuel studied his father's face. Something had changed, though Edwin forced a faint smile between bites. He kept glancing toward the front window as if expecting someone. A knock came just after 8. Sharp, deliberate. Samuel answered to find 2 men in long coats waiting. One was a clerk from the textile exchange, the other a messenger carrying a sealed envelope. Edwin took the letter without a word. His eyes scanned the page, his jaw tightening before he folded it neatly and slipped it into his vest pocket. "Thank you, gentlemen," he said. The visitors nodded and left, their boots echoing down the street. Edwin stood for a moment by the doorway, listening to the sound fade into silence. Samuel tried to ask if it was bad news, but Edwin only patted his shoulder. "Business," he said. "Always business." Then he turned to his desk and began sorting papers with mechanical precision. Thomas and Henry watched from the stairs. Even they could sense the tension. The photograph on the mantel seemed to watch, too, sepia faces fixed in a stillness that mocked the uneasy morning. By mid-morning, the neighborhood felt heavier than usual. Clouds gathered, dull and gray. Neighbors exchanged short greetings but lingered at their doors, unsettled by a quiet they couldn't name. Around 10, the mail carrier passed by and later claimed he saw Edwin through the window, sitting perfectly still at his desk, hands clasped before him, eyes fixed on the photograph. When Samuel returned from the shop to fetch supplies, the air inside the house felt colder. The stove had gone out, though no one remembered letting it die. He called out for his father, then for his brothers. The echo of his voice bounced back down the hallway. Only the clock answered, ticking too loud in the emptiness. In the street, a carriage halted. Two local men, neighbors who often helped with deliveries, stepped down, drawn by the sight of the open door. They called to Samuel, concern in their tone. Together they moved through the rooms, each step deliberate, cautious. The quiet pressed harder with every heartbeat. Drawers left open, papers on the floor, the faint smell of smoke and oil. In the study, Edwin's chair was overturned. The desk lamp still burned, its glass cracked from heat. The photograph had fallen, its frame splintered on the carpet. Samuel's throat tightened. "They're not here," he whispered, scanning the shadows for movement. His brothers' coats were gone, their boots missing from the rack. One of the neighbors found a note folded near the window. The ink had bled slightly from the damp. No signature, just a few lines written in Edwin's hand. "Keep the business alive. Protect your brothers." They searched the yard, the shed, the lane beyond. No footprints led away, only the soft impressions of wheels that might have been from any passing cart. By noon, the sheriff arrived, a broad man with a trimmed beard and a cautious way of speaking. He ordered the house sealed until they could question everyone nearby. Word spread quickly through Hartford. Whispers grew into theories, perhaps a sudden debt collection, perhaps a flight from shame, perhaps something darker no one dared name aloud. That evening, the sheriff stood by the broken photograph frame, staring at the pale faces beneath cracked glass. "Something happened here," he said quietly, "but it's not done with us yet." The search widened into the outskirts of town. Riverbanks were checked, train stations questioned. Men who knew Edwin spoke of his stubbornness, his pride, his refusal to ask for help. Days turned to weeks, yet no sign came. No letter, no body, no trace. The house remained untouched except for the investigators who cataloged every nail and paper as evidence. In time, Hartford's busy streets swallowed the story. New shipments arrived, new businesses opened. Life moved forward, but the photograph lingered in the archives, a puzzle no one could finish. Years later, townsmen still spoke of that morning. The eerie stillness, the unanswered questions, the sense that the Graves men had stepped out of time itself, leaving only their image behind. And so the legend grew, that sometimes history erases its own witnesses, leaving behind nothing but silence, and one photograph that refuses to let the past rest quietly. Weeks passed before anyone dared reopen Edwin's shop. The wooden shutters stayed closed, the dust thickening with each day that passed. Hartford had a way of moving on, yet the memory lingered like smoke. Samuel took charge of the keys, though his hands trembled as he unlocked the door. The faint smell of cloth, dye, and oil rose from the shelves. Everything was as Edwin had left it, too neat, too deliberate. He began sorting through the papers his father had kept hidden. Ledgers filled with red ink, letters from suppliers, polite words masking quiet threats. Each page revealed how deep the debts had gone. Among them was a sealed envelope addressed only to S.G. in Edwin's sharp handwriting. Samuel hesitated before opening it, afraid of what truth waited inside. The note was brief. "If this reaches you, keep the business from those who would destroy it. There are men in town who will not forgive me." The words chilled him. It wasn't just about debt. It was about betrayal. Someone had been closing in, and Edwin had known it. That afternoon, Samuel met with Mr. Hargrove, a banker who had worked with his father. The man's mustache twitched nervously as he adjusted his spectacles. "Your father was good," he said, "but he borrowed from the wrong men." Samuel pressed him for names, but Hargrove refused. "Not all accounts go through this bank," he whispered. "Some are handled privately." Outside, the sky dimmed again. The same heavy gray that had hung over Hartford since that morning seemed unwilling to leave. Thomas and Henry waited back at the house, their faces drawn. They were too young to understand fully, yet old enough to feel the dread creeping in. Samuel told them as little as possible, though the truth clung to every word he didn't say. Their father had owed more than money. He had owed loyalty to the wrong people. That night, Samuel searched the study once more. Beneath a loose floorboard, he found a small tin box. Inside were 3 folded letters and a ledger with unfamiliar handwriting. The letters were signed with initials: J.L., M.R., H.T., names that meant nothing to him. The handwriting was rough, the language colder than business. Payment due, no extensions, silence or consequence. Samuel stared at them under the dim glow of the desk lamp. Whoever those men were, they weren't bankers. They were something else entirely. He took the documents to the sheriff, who studied them with a frown. "This handwriting," he said slowly, "matches others we've seen. There's been trouble like this in 3 other towns." Hartford wasn't alone. Across the region, small merchants had vanished after dealing with the same kind of investors, men who promised rescue and delivered ruin. The sheriff warned Samuel to stay quiet. "If your father crossed them," he said, "they might still be watching." That night, Samuel couldn't sleep. He sat by the fireplace, the photograph beside him. The flicker of flame reflected in those still eyes, frozen in their quiet warning. He remembered something, the way his father had looked past him that final morning, as if expecting a knock. It hadn't been the debt collectors or the bank. It had been them. The next morning, a stranger appeared at the shop. Tall, neatly dressed, carrying a walking stick polished to a shine. "You must be young Graves," he said pleasantly. "Your father and I had dealings." Samuel's pulse quickened. The man introduced himself as Mr. Langford, one of the initials from the letters. He smiled too easily, spoke too calmly. "I'm here to help finish his affairs," he said. Langford left a card and promised to return the next day. Samuel waited until he was gone, then burned the card in the stove, watching the smoke curl and vanish. That night, he moved the photograph to his room. He couldn't explain why, but it felt safer near him. The faces of his father and brothers were a kind of anchor in a storm of half-truths. When Langford returned, he found the shop empty. Samuel and his brothers were gone. The neighbors would later say they saw the 3 leaving town before sunrise, a wagon creaking toward the west. Weeks later, the sheriff received a letter postmarked from Ohio. Inside was a note in Samuel's hand. "We're safe for now. Tell them the Graves' debts are settled." The sheriff folded the note and placed it beside the original photograph in the town's records. He knew what those words really meant: silence, secrecy, survival. Years would pass before Hartford spoke of the Graves again. The shop was sold, the house torn down, but the story lingered like an unfinished sentence. Some said the brothers rebuilt their business under new names. Others whispered they kept running, never staying long enough for the past to find them. In the archives, the photograph remained. 5 figures caught in stillness, their eyes too knowing, their fate too uncertain. And beneath the glass, a faint reflection seemed to shimmer whenever light touched it, as if the story itself refused to die. Decades later, Hartford had changed almost beyond recognition. The mills that once coughed smoke over the river had fallen silent, their windows boarded, their bricks faded to rust-brown memories. A young historian named Daniel Carter arrived from Boston with a passion for forgotten stories. He had heard a rumor about a missing merchant family and a photograph locked somewhere in the town's archives. The archivist, an old clerk with trembling hands, led him through shelves stacked with ledgers and brittle envelopes. "Most of this has been untouched since before your grandfather was born," he muttered. Daniel found the box labeled Graves E. Inside lay a cracked frame, the photograph sealed behind yellowed glass. The 5 faces looked back at him, perfectly still, their clothes dusted with the faint shimmer of time. He studied each expression. The father's stiff posture, the eldest son's wary eyes, the younger boys standing like soldiers beside them. Nothing dramatic, yet everything about it felt weighted. Curiosity drew Daniel deeper. He requested the coroner's notes, the sheriff's statements, the old bank records. Piece by piece, he traced the web that had surrounded Edwin Graves and his sons. The letters from those mysterious creditors had been copied by hand into police reports. Margins filled with guesses, traveling financiers, itinerant investors, false lenders. No names survived beyond initials. One report caught his attention. A deputy had noted seeing 3 men leaving Hartford by rail 2 days after the Graves' disappearance. They paid cash and carried a wooden crate. Destination: Chicago. Daniel wondered if the brothers had escaped east or west, if they'd changed their names to outrun both guilt and danger. He followed every scrap he could find: tax ledgers, land deeds, shipping logs. In a small county record from Indiana, he found something. A merchant registration under S.G. and Brothers, dated 1904. The handwriting matched Samuel's from the old letter. It was enough to suggest survival. The Graves brothers had lived on, quietly rebuilding under new identities. Yet the business dissolved within 3 years, leaving nothing but unpaid taxes and silence. Daniel couldn't stop thinking about them. 3 young men burdened with their father's shadow, the debts, the flight. What lives had they made in those lost years between truth and rumor? He traveled west, following faint traces, a ledger here, a rumor there. In Kansas City, he uncovered an invoice signed simply H.G., the youngest brother, Henry. Same slanted script, same inked flourish. Each discovery felt like touching the ghost of a life unfinished. No graves, no records of death, just trails that vanished into the noise of modern America. When he returned to Hartford, Daniel brought with him copies of every clue. He spread them on the long wooden table of the archive, the photograph at the center like a silent compass. He noticed something then, something that hadn't been obvious before. The photograph's surface had tiny lines of damage that almost formed shapes, faint as breath marks. Under magnification, they looked like scratches. But arranged together, they resembled letters, initials. The same 3 from the old threatening notes: J.L., M.R., H.T. Daniel exhaled slowly. It could have been coincidence, a trick of time and light, or it could mean someone had tampered with the photograph long ago, someone marking it as a warning. He recorded the finding, but he didn't send it to the newspapers. He felt the story was too human for headlines. It wasn't about crime anymore. It was about endurance, silence, and what men carry forward when everything else collapses. Before leaving Hartford, he visited the empty lot where the Graves house had stood. Only the foundation stones remained, half buried in weeds. The air there was unnaturally still. He imagined Edwin sitting by the fire, worrying over unpaid bills, Samuel sorting ledgers, the younger brothers whispering about plans they would never finish. All those voices now gone, replaced by the hum of passing traffic. Daniel knelt and brushed dust from one of the stones. Beneath it he found a rusted hinge, part of the old mantel perhaps, where the photograph once stood. He kept it as a token. On the train back east, he reread the last line of Edwin's letter. Protect your brothers. It wasn't a command anymore. It was an echo of every man who'd ever tried to shield those he loved from a world too harsh to forgive. Years later, Daniel's research was published in a small historical journal. The Graves case was no longer called a tragedy, but An unresolved migration, the story of men who vanished, survived, and became something unrecorded. The photograph remained in Hartford's Historical Society. Visitors who looked at it often said it gave them a strange feeling, a mixture of calm and unease, as though the faces were aware of being remembered. Under new lighting, modern scanners revealed smudges invisible before, faint outlines of hands at the edges, the photographer's shadow blending into theirs, binding them forever in that fragile rectangle of paper and light. No one ever proved exactly what happened. Yet the legend persisted that the Graves photograph holds not just 5 men, but the moment when an age of certainty cracked open into doubt. Standing before it today, one sees more than faces. One sees ambition, failure, pride, secrecy, and the quiet endurance of men who left behind only a mystery and a memory. And as long as someone stops to look, that memory endures, a small defiance against time, reminding us that every story, no matter how faded, still breathes beneath the dust.